Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and welcome to today's episode. I know it's a day late. I am so sorry, but you know what? Yesterday was kind of an important day, and I was a little distracted while I was trying to finish up research because, I was just waiting for the college announcement on who was going to potentially be in the playoffs and what that was going to look like. So forgive me. Also, there's a presidential election that we're not going to talk about because we don't get political on this channel. So sorry about the delay. Next time, I'll try and make sure I get everything ready before those college rankings are released. So anyways, today, I am excited because we have another listener suggestion, and I want to thank Austin for submitting this suggestion. I'm pretty excited to talk about this. This is a horrible, horrendous case. So thank you, Austin, for that. If you like this channel, if you're liking what you hear, if you like these creepy, spooky stories about these horrible humans in history, please make sure you are liking and subscribing to the podcast, and make sure you're sharing it with all of your friends, all of your family, anybody who likes to hear some spookiness in their lives, shake things up a little bit. So again, thanks, Austin, for the suggestion. So when you think of serial killers, there are a few that come to mind instantly. Today, we are going to be talking about one of those serial killers that almost immediately pops into your mind when you talk about serial killers. He appeared as a pretty normal guy who flew under the radar. No one really cared much about, they cared about him, but he just seemed like this normal dude that blended in. So much so that the police were literally at his house with a corpse of one of his victims, and he didn't get caught. They didn't even notice, because he was just so unassuming and so chill that no one thought too much about him. Today, we are going to be talking about the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. So let's jump in to his terribly awful tale. Say, when I think about Jeffrey Dahmer and his case and his story, I always picture way back in the day, and I know for you younger viewers, this is going to sound silly, but I pictured all of these events happening in the late 60s, early 70s. But no, it happens in the late 80s, early 90s, which blew my mind because that seems super recent. Again, you younger viewers are going to be like, no, that was ancient old times. But to me, as an ancient old person, that seems super recent. So it kind of blew my mind to see all the dates on here because I didn't realize how close it was to nowadays. So anyways, so let's jump into this. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was born in Lionel Herbert. He was born to his father, Lionel Herbert Dahmer, and his mother, Joyce Annette Dahmer. Lionel was a chemistry student at Marquette University and would actually later become a research chemist. And he loved chemistry and eventually at some point would show his son, Jeffrey, some of the chemistry that Jeffrey tried to use later in life. More on that in a minute. But his mother's Joyce was a teletype machine instructor. And there's some conflicting stories about Jeffrey and his infancy and childhood. A lot of people say that he was deprived of attention as an infant and as a child, and others say that he was doted upon as an infant. But I kind of lean more to believing the deprived of attention theory, because later as a child, that was kind of the norm for him, is he was pretty ignored, pretty neglected, not as far as with food and things, just with attention and love. So I'm leaning more towards that's probably what happened when he was an infant as well. His mother would actually give birth to another son, so they would often compete for attention from their parents, which I feel like becomes a little important later as far as a motive of I don't want you to leave me, I want you to always be with me. Anyways, we'll get into that a little later. So his parents didn't get along very well and were actually often fighting with one another. His mother was an argumentative person who always demanded attention and demanded pity. She was known to be a hypochondriac who also suffered from depression, and his father was frequently gone because he was off studying at school. So the kids were left at home with their mother, who was suffering from depression, and his mother spent more and more time in bed, and at one point even attempted to kill herself. So between having to grow up with a mother suffering from those mental illnesses and his father just being gone all the time, the boys got very, very little attention from their parents, and Dahmer really struggled forming any kind of emotional attachment with family because of this. And when he was younger, he had been a very energetic, happy child. But at the age of 4, he had a double hernia surgery. After this surgery, he became very shy and quiet in school and had a very small number of friends. So he had a pretty hard time making friends at school. In 1966, the family would move to Doylestown, Ohio. And in this same year, that's the year his little brother would be born, and his father would finally finish his degree and started working as a chemist. And at a very young age, Dahmer showed a fascination with dead animals. Are we surprised? This seems to be a trend with a lot of our killers, but he was just fascinated. He specifically liked the bones of dead animals, and at one point, his father even showed him how to safely bleach old bones using his chemistry knowledge, because he believed that his son was more interested in the science behind the bones. But in reality, he was more interested in the death of the bones. Not so much the science. So keep that bone bleaching training in mind. His father had no idea. He thought it was just some innocent science thing. Just keep that in mind for later. So in 1968, the family would move again to Bath Township in Summit County, Ohio. Their home was surrounded by woodlands, and Dahmer would begin collecting skeletons of animals and a bunch of different kinds of insects from the woods. So he basically had his own collection in this shed of all these animal skeletons and different kinds of insects. In 1975, Dahmer actually found the dead body of a dog, and he cut the head off of the dog, nailed the body to a tree, and then impaled the head on top of the stick. And he did all of this in the woods right behind his house and decided it would be a really funny prank on one of his friends. So he invited his friend over and happened to stumble upon this macabre display claiming that, oh, I just found it like this, but he was the one who actually set it up. And when Dahmer entered his freshman year at Revere High School, he was pretty much seen as an outcast at that point. Like, he barely had any friends. And at the age of 14, he actually had already started drinking, not just like a little bit, not to try and be cool, but he was drinking pretty heavily, like alcoholic level drinking by the age of 14. He even was drinking hard liquor in the middle of the day. And one day his classmates asked him why he was drinking scotch so early in the morning. And he said, well, it's my medicine. So he would literally just come to school and drink scotch early in the morning. At 14, mind you. Like, I want to know how he was getting all this booze. That's what I want to know. So, anyways, his teachers initially saw him as pretty polite, very intelligent, but he only earned average grades, which, I feel like doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't very intelligent. It could just be he was bored and didn't really care about school, but was highly intelligent, which is what I'm guessing. He also, fun fact, was a competitive tennis player in high school and even played briefly for the school band. So, fun facts. It was in his teen years that he would actually discover that he was attracted to other men. He wouldn't tell his parents about these feelings and kept this to himself, while he started to fantasize about things that eventually would tie to dissection. We're not really sure how his attraction to men eventually ended up like being stimulated, I guess, by the thought of dissecting people, but that happened somehow. Anyways, when he was 16, he actually fantasized about doing things to someone who was unconscious. And he was aware that there was a man who consistently jogged throughout the neighborhood every day. And Dahmer actually came up with a plan to hide in the bushes and then knock out this jogger as he ran by and then, do things to him. So the day that he decided to execute his fantasy, the jogger had actually decided not to go for a run that day. Probably the best decision ever to slack on a workout. Can I just say, Jeffrey was waiting for him. He was in the bushes. He was ready to go. But the guy never showed up because he just decided he didn't want to go for a jog that day. You know what? Best excuse ever to not go for a run. I like it. So, in 1977, Dahmer's grades began to quickly decline, and he became the class clown and very disruptive. And his parents even hired a private tutor to try and help Dahmer, but it had very, very little impact because remember, at this time, he is basically a raging alcoholic. It also didn't help that his parents' relationship had declined pretty severely, with basically all of their interactions being fights. In that same year, his mother had a short affair with his father discovered this affair, which eventually led to his parents divorcing. The divorce became super bitter, even though at the beginning they agreed that it would be amicable and they would be able to get along. Oh, that didn't happen. It became bitter super fast. And so in 1978, Dahmer moved away from home from both of his parents and temporarily lived in a motel in North Cleveland, Massillon Road. So a little ways from his home. So in May of 1978, Dahmer would graduate from high school, and a few months later, his mother, against a court order, would move away from the family home and take her other son with her to go live with other family. This left Jeffrey to live alone in the family home. So basically, he had this whole house to himself because his dad was gone and his mother had left. So now he had a home to himself because his father didn't know that his mother had left. So 3 weeks, just 3 weeks after his graduation, Dahmer would begin down that slippery slope of becoming a serial killer and kill his first victim. So on June 18th, 1978, Dahmer picked up Stephen Mark Hicks, an 18-year-old who had been hitchhiking. He was trying to get to a concert, and Dahmer picked him up and promised him, let's go home, have some drinks, just hang out, chill, that kind of thing. And Stephen agreed to have a few beers with Dahmer. Like I said, Stephen had been planning on going to a rock concert, but would never make it. Because while they were drinking, Stephen started talking about girls and all the girls he planned to pick up at the concert and how hot they were and what he liked in girls. And Dahmer realized that Stephen would not like any advances that Dahmer had planned to make on Stephen at that point. So after a few hours of the two young men talking and drinking and listening to music, Stephen decided, you know what, it's time for me to go. I mean, I really want to make it to my concert, so I probably should leave. Well, Dahmer didn't want him to go because he didn't want to be alone. Like I mentioned before, he really did not want to be alone and didn't like giving him the option of leaving. So, when Stephen wasn't looking, Dahmer grabbed a dumbbell and struck Stephen from behind until he was unconscious. Once he was unconscious, Dahmer would strangle him to death using the dumbbell. And seeing the lifeless body of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey was able to fulfill some of his fantasies, which we won't get into. No, he's gross, and it just gets worse later. So anyways, hours after killing Stephen Hicks, he would drag the body into the basement of the home, and then the next day, he would dissect the body and then bury the remains in a shallow grave. Well, don't worry, he was not done with Stephen Hicks. Weeks later, he would unbury the body, use acid to remove any remaining flesh from the bones, dump that solution of flesh down the toilet, and then crushed up all the remaining bones with a sledgehammer, and then scattered the bone dust in the woods behind his house. And yeah, this was just his first murder. Doesn't seem like it. Seems like he had this thought out, but isn't that just horrible? Anyways, 6 weeks after the murder, his father and his father's fiancée would finally check in on his son to discover that he was living alone, and his dad did not like that. His father made him enroll in Ohio State University because he's like, you need to do something with your life. And so he enrolled with a major in business. Because he was an alcoholic, he failed most of his classes and only got one slightly good grade, and that was a B- in riflery. So he was pretty good in his rifle class, got a B-, which still isn't amazing. His GPA at the university was a 0.45. Now, I work at a university, and that is impressive. I mean, you really have to try to get a GPA that bad. Like, you have to work to get that bad of a GPA. That is impressive. So, obviously, he drops out of school after only 3 months because he's not doing well. Now, his father decided to try on a different tactic to help his son get his life on track. In January of 1979, Dahmer would enlist in the United States Army. His drinking would haunt him throughout his time in the Army, though. He just could not give up the alcohol. He couldn't give up the booze. He was even actually beaten up by his platoon, like pretty severely beaten by his platoon, for causing them to be punished because Dahmer was insubordinate. So, he also was not super popular in the military, at least with his fellow cadets. So on July 13th, 1979, he was actually deployed to West Germany, where he was a combat medic. And at first, he was known as a slightly above average soldier. Well, that obviously didn't last because he was such a raging alcoholic by this point. In March of 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for service and was honorably discharged from the Army, with the Army thinking that his issues wouldn't be a problem in civilian life. Wow. Did they misread that entire situation? Yes. Yes, they did. So, not wanting to face his father, Dahmer actually was sent back to Florida, where he was super determined to make it on his own because he didn't want to let his dad down again, and he just wanted to prove that he could make it on his own. He got a job at a delicatessen shop and got himself a hotel room or a motel room. I don't know what the difference is. Anyways, it was a motel room, and he spent every dime that he earned at his job on alcohol and was eventually kicked out of the motel for non-payment. But he decided, I'll just sleep on the beach and still keep working until one day he realized, you know what, I don't want to keep doing this. So he called his dad and begged his dad to see if he could come home. Well, his father and stepmother allowed him to move back in with them, but he was under strict direction to follow rules about doing chores and not drinking, smoking, all of that kind of stuff while he looked for work. After only 2 weeks of being home, he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct and fined $60 and given a 10-day jail sentence. His father tried desperately to get his son weaned off of alcohol, but nothing worked. Like, he was so frustrated and had no idea what to do to help his son, which I'm like, I feel like you should have picked up on this when he was 14, but I don't know. That's just me. Anyways, in December of 1981, they had enough and actually sent Dahmer to his paternal grandmother's home to live with her. Now, the reason why they did that is because she was literally the only person in the family that Dahmer actually connected with. He really listened to his grandmother and respected his grandmother. And he actually followed all of her house rules, willingly helped with chores, and even went to church with her. I mean, he still continued to smoke and drink. He was still doing all of that, but he wouldn't do it in the house. He followed her rules. In 1982, he got a job as a phlebotomist at a Milwaukee blood plasma center, but was laid off only 10 months later. And after that, he was unemployed for 2 years, living off of whatever his amazing grandma was willing to give him. On August 8th, 1982, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair Park, where he had exposed himself in the presence of over 25 people, including children. So, yeah. He was convicted and fined $50 plus his court costs. Now, so this is his, second or third encounter with the police. So, just so you know, he will become well known to the police, which is mind-blowing, and you will see why later. He eventually caught a break and was hired in 1985 as a mixer at Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. He would work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. with only Saturday evenings off, so he was working every day except for Saturday nights. In his free time, he started to frequent all the gay bars and all the gay bathhouses. And he even got this part. Oh gosh. He even got a male mannequin from a store to use to pleasure himself. But when his grandmother discovered this in his closet, she made him throw it out. She was upset and disturbed and made him throw it out immediately. And he really enjoyed those bathhouses that he would frequent. And he would, at the bathhouses, have encounters with other men. And he found he didn't like these encounters too much because his partners how do I say this? They were too alive for his liking. And it's not even that they were too alive. It was more of like they had too much movement or like freedom of movement. Like they weren't, I don't know how to explain it. They just weren't like a puppet to him, I guess is a good way to put it. Maybe I'll just let him explain it. So he said that, quote, I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people. There you go. So in his mind, in his twisted mind, he only saw people as objects. And so these encounters he was having were too personal, I guess. He wanted people to be more objects than other people. So he began to spike the drinks of the men that he met in the bathhouses with sedatives and wait until they were asleep to do the things. And he would get the drugs from his doctor by saying that he worked at night and needed something to help him sleep during the day so he could adjust his sleep schedule. Eventually, the bathhouse staff actually caught him doing this, and he lost his membership, so he was kicked out. They did not like that for some unknown reason, their clients are getting knocked out. So very soon after he lost his bathhouse membership, he saw an obituary for an 18-year-old kid that had passed away, and he decided he was going to dig up the body so he could have it to do whatever he wished to it. Well, it turns out digging up a grave is really hard work, so he actually gave up on that idea after trying to dig for a little bit. He said the ground was too hard. So I am super grateful he was not able to do that, because that is disturbing. This whole story is disturbing. So Dahmer was arrested again on September 8th in 1986 for lewd and lascivious behavior for pleasuring himself in the presence of young boys. He was sentenced to 1 year probation with instructions to get counseling. I'm guessing the counseling did not work. Almost 10 years. So this is almost 10 years after the murder of his first victim. Dahmer would find his next victim. On November 20th, 1987, while still living with his grandma, by the way, he met a man named Stephen Tuomi at a bar. He convinced Stephen, which I just realized shares the same first name as Dahmer's first victim. How eerie is that? I actually think a lot of his victims have very similar first names, which is so crazy and creepy. But anyways, he was able to convince him to come back to a hotel room in Milwaukee that Dahmer had actually rented out for the night. Dahmer had drugged Stephen to do, whatever he wanted to do with him. And he claims that he had no intentions of killing Stephen that night. 0 intentions. But when Dahmer woke up the next morning, he found Stephen dead, laying underneath him with his chest crushed in. And the rest of his body was black and blue with bruises, and there was actually blood trickling out of his mouth. Now, Dahmer claims that he had no memory of hurting Stephen. He had no memory of doing anything to him. Do I believe that? Not really, but he claimed that all through his trials and everything. Like, he maintained that he could not remember doing anything. So anyways, Dahmer had run out quickly to purchase a large suitcase to transport Stephen's body to his grandmother's house, where a week later he dismembered the body. Now, I won't go into the details of this. It's just know it is very disturbing. But let's just say he ended up keeping Stephen's skull for his own pleasures. Yeah. It was at this point that Dahmer decided he was no longer going to try and control his impulses. He decided that I'm just going to go with it. And even recognized that they were bad. He realized these were not great impulses, but, whatever urges came to him, he was just going to do it. So 2 months after Stephen's death, Dahmer came across a 14-year-old boy named James Daxter. Dahmer promised him $50 if James would just let him take nude pictures of him. The boy agreed, so he went home to Dahmer's grandma's house. Yeah, most of these murders happened in grandma's house, where after doing adult things with Dahmer would drug the boy and strangle him on his grandmother's cellar floor. His body was left there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks! He's living with his grandma, and she didn't notice this. His body was left for 2 weeks, and he would dispose of the body again, keeping the skull for 2 weeks before he disposed of it. So Jeffrey was trying to, bleach these skulls to make them white, but it made it very fragile. He didn't follow his father's instructions, and it made them very fragile. And so once they became too fragile to, play with, he would just crush them up and dispose of them. So in March 24th, 1988, Dahmer met 22-year-old Richard Guerrero outside of a gay bar called the Phoenix. He made the same promise of $50 to spend the night with him. So, of course, they went back to his grandma's house. I want to point out that Dahmer, when he was looking for his victims, he specifically targeted men that when he was talking to them at the bar or at the bathhouse or wherever he met them, he would always ask, does your family know that you're gay? And are they supportive or not? And if the person he was talking to said, oh yeah, my family's aware that I'm gay and they are very supportive of me and they help me all the time, they're the greatest, he did not target these people. He targeted the men that said, oh yeah, my family knows I'm gay and they don't support me. In fact, they kicked me out. I don't have a good relationship with my parents. In fact, I'm estranged from them. I don't really talk to them. He purposely targeted the men that had been disowned. So if the man said, my family supports me, he would leave them alone. He'd be like, okay, you're not for me. Anyways, I think it's important to point that out. So after he drugged Richard, like he did everyone, he would strangle him with a leather strap and then did very naughty things to the man's body. And then this time, he actually disposed of the body within 24 hours instead of letting it just sit there for a few weeks. But again, he kept the skull until it was too fragile to keep months later. Almost exactly a month later, Dahmer would lure Ronald Flowers Jr. back to his grandma's house. But thankfully, Dahmer was stopped from killing Ronald because his grandmother actually came home and called for Dahmer. Just like, Jeffrey, are you home? And she realized that Jeffrey was not alone. So Flowers was actually able to survive this encounter, thankfully, because Grandma interrupted, even though Dahmer had already drugged him. Dahmer knew that his grandma knew there was someone with him, so he could not kill him. So by September of 1988, his grandmother had had enough of her grandson bringing men over all the time, and his drinking habits were out of control. Not to mention, she was getting very sick of the foul smells coming from the basement and the garage, which, by the way, she had no clue what that was. She just knew it smelled really bad. She didn't know why, and she was just getting really sick and tired of dealing with him. So she told him that he needed to leave. So he would find an apartment and move in on his own on September 25th, 1988. Literally only 2 days later, it only took him 2 days to get arrested for drugging and doing other things to a 13-year-old boy. which I want to point out at this point, he is well known by the police for doing this kind of stuff to children, being indecent around children. Like, I feel like this should be a giant red flag to the police. But spoilers, we'll get into that a little later. So in January, he was convicted of his crimes and with the child, and then moved back in with his grandmother. So he didn't last very long out on his own. So 2 months after his conviction and prior to his delayed sentencing, so he hadn't been sentenced for child molestation yet. He had just been convicted. So in between the conviction and the sentencing, Dahmer killed his 5th victim. 24-year-old Anthony Sears met Dahmer at a gay bar on March 25th, 1989. Dahmer claimed he wasn't actually planning on killing anyone that night, but Anthony just happened to start talking to him just before closing time. So that's when he decided, you know what? Why not? He followed the same pattern of taking him to his grandmother's home, drugging him, and then strangling him. The next morning, he disposed of the body. However, he found Anthony so attractive that this would be the first victim in which he would keep multiple body parts, including specific body parts, in a jar with acetone. Not to mention his head. He also kept his head. On May 23rd, 1989, he was sentenced for his actions with the 13-year-old boy. He was given 5 years of probation and 1 year in the House of Corrections, but he was allowed to keep his job and leave to go to work. He also had to register as a sex offender, which again confuses me, and you will see why later. On May 14th, 1990, he moved out of his grandma's house again to an apartment, and he brought with him the head and other body parts he had kept of Anthony. Now, a week after he moved into his apartment, he would kill his 6th victim, Raymond Smith. Raymond was 32-year-old. He was a prostitute that Dahmer promised $50 to Raymond to come home with him. Again, he drugged his victim and strangled him. The next day, this was new, he took pictures of his victim using the Polaroid camera in suggestive positions. Then he would boil the body, dissolve the bones, and when he was done, he obviously kept the skull, which at one point he decided to spray paint and put in a drawer with Anthony's. So, yeah, he's starting to get more creative with what he's doing with his poor victims' bodies. Only 1 week later, Dahmer would lure another victim back to his apartment, but instead of giving the sedative drink to his would-be victim, he actually drank it himself on accident. And when he woke up, I find this part of the story so ironic and so hilarious. When Dahmer woke up, he had been robbed by the man and had multiple missing clothes. He had $300 missing, and an expensive watch was gone, which is just so ironic and well-deserved. I mean, he deserves way more than just being robbed, but he didn't report this to the police, obviously, because he didn't want the police snooping around his house. But in June 1990, Dahmer would kill 27-year-old Edward Smith using the same exact methods. But this time, he was experimenting with how to preserve the skull so it wouldn't get fragile so quickly. But the skull ended up exploding in the oven when he was trying to dry it. So Dahmer would later say he felt, quote, rotten about Smith's murder because he couldn't keep any of his body parts. Blech. Ew, 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 ew. Oh, he only felt bad because he wasn't able to keep a body part. That is so disturbing. He then would kill Ernest Miller, a 22-year-old. This time, he actually killed Miller with a knife. He took pictures of the body and kept the head, not just the skull, like the actual head, and other random body parts in his freezer. So, yeah. His next victim he killed on September 24th, which was a 22-year-old David Thomas, who was a father of two. But after Dahmer had drugged him and David was unconscious, he realized he wasn't actually attracted to him anymore, but couldn't really let him wake up because then he would report that he was drugged or whatever. So he ended up killing him and took pictures and then disposed of the body. And this time he didn't keep any body parts because he just was not attracted to David and felt no need to keep anything near him. Ugh, so gross. After killing David, Dahmer actually didn't kill anyone for almost 5 months. I just want to point out, while he was killing all of these people, he was on freaking probation. He was on probation. How is this possible? He's murdering all these people and he's on freaking probation. But 5 months, that David killed it for him for 5 whole months. He actually tried multiple times in October of 1990 through February of 1991 to lure victims back to his apartment, but nothing is working. And throughout this time, he became kind of suicidal. But in February of 1991, he successfully lured a 17-year-old named Curtis Strotter back to his apartment with a promise of money for nude photos. This guy was not creative. He used the same excuse, but I guess it worked for some reason. Now, he would kill Curtis and keep his skull, hands, and other body parts. Now, on April 7th, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay would be his first victim, where Dahmer is trying to create his own personal zombie. And you're probably thinking, what the heck does that mean? Oh, it means that Dahmer decided he wanted to start experimenting on his victims because he was sick of the victims dying, because he wanted to keep them around forever to have them as his own basically personal toy. But he didn't want them to die, so he was trying to find a way to keep them alive, but submissive, so basically his own personal zombie. So what he would do is he would drill a hole. He drilled a hole in Errol's skull and injected hydrochloric acid with a turkey baster. Obviously, this didn't work at first. Errol woke up and was like, oh man, my head really hurts. And so he gave him more sedative and put more acid in there, but that actually ended up killing him because he was trying to make him into that zombie. He just put too much acid into his brain. Like, I'm intentionally being really vague about body parts and stuff that he's preserving because it's incredibly disturbing what he did to these men's bodies, and I don't want to go into super graphic detail. Just know it's horrendous. So sorry if it seems like I'm being vague, but I'm being vague on purpose. So you guys don't have to deal with the horror that I read about and all of that. Anyways, later in 1991, people began to complain that there was a terrible smell coming from his apartment, obviously. And there were always weird sounds like large things falling on the ground and chainsaws coming from his apartment. Yeah, I'd be a little suspicious if I continued to hear multiple chainsaw sounds coming from an apartment. Yeah. So when the landlord came to actually check on it because they got so many complaints, Dahmer was just like, oh, I'm so sorry. My freezer broke, so all my food spoiled. That's why it smells so terrible. Yeah, and they bought it. So on May 24th, 1991, he would kill 31-year-old Tony Hughes, drill holes in his skull, inject acid. However, the acid immediately killed him this time. So there was no like waking up and being like, oh, my head is killing me. No. He just immediately died. And here is the story, or part of the story, that not only blows my mind, but also makes me sick to my stomach. And you are going to see exactly why. So on May 26th, 1991, Dahmer encountered 14-year-old Konarek Synthesonophone, who, by the way, happened to be the younger brother of the boy he had been convicted of sexually molesting in 1998. Yeah. So he offered the boy money for pictures, and the boy was fairly hesitant at first, but agreed after Dahmer said, "Oh, you can keep your underwear on. You don't have to be completely nude." And he was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'll do that." So he drugged the boy and brought him into the bedroom where, by the way, Tony Hughes' body was still there on the floor, decomposing after only killing him 3 days before. So yeah, he's still in there, just laying naked on the floor. So once he drugged the boy and brought him into the bedroom, he then drilled small holes into his head and injected the hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Well, Dahmer decided at that point that he was ready to take a break and drink a beer and ended up falling asleep. So while Dahmer was asleep, Konarek actually woke up and left the apartment while Dahmer was sleeping. He ran down the road and 3 women saw him in distress, sitting naked on the street corner, probably with blood coming out of his head because he's got holes in his head. And the women called the police. And when the police arrived, so did Dahmer. He told police that Konarek was his boyfriend and they were just having a lover's quarrel and everything was fine. And at first, the police were slightly suspicious. Now, this is where I'm like, you didn't actually check on this person. You didn't look him up to see if there was any questionable behavior in his past. You just ask him, okay, so you tell me what's going on. Because then they asked, how old is this kid? And Dahmer was the one who responded and said, oh, he's 19. He's 19. No, he was 14. But they didn't ask the kid, they asked Dahmer. And the women began to protest because they could tell that there was something off. And the police told them to shut up. Yeah. I would have gone off. Could you imagine? But then the firemen showed up just to check on the injuries that they had found on Konarek and suggested that he actually received medical treatment. But the police sent them away saying that he was probably fine. Which again, blows my mind. This part of the story is just so insane to me. So the police actually walked with Dahmer and Konarek back to Dahmer's apartment, where the police did a quick look through of the apartment. Literally stuck their head into the bedroom where Tony Hughes' body is literally laying on the bedroom floor. And they saw nothing. They didn't notice the smell, which is shocking. And they left Konarek with Dahmer. And almost immediately after the police left, Dahmer would kill him by injecting more acid into his brain. That is just so heartbreaking. It actually makes me pretty angry because he was well known to the police. How is this possible? How is this even possible? I am so sickened by the actions of the police and the lack of investigating skills on the police's part. You didn't look up this person at all. You didn't call in and say, hey, can you check to see if this person is on parole or has a record of any kind? But the worst part is he made victims out of the same family. He tortured a child. He did inappropriate things to their oldest child, and now he just killed their next child. It's so disgusting to me. Anyways, he would go on to kill 4 more men between June 30th and July 19th of that year. On July 22nd of 1991, he would approach 3 men offering them $100 for one of them to come home with him, provide him company, and do some nude photos. one of the three men, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to come home with Dahmer. When they entered Dahmer's home, he immediately noticed a foul smell and boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor and was instantly put on edge. He was immediately like, something weird's going on here. I don't like this. So Dahmer told him, you should come and look at my tropical fish. Look, they're right over there. And when Tracy turned his head, Dahmer tried to put handcuffs on Tracy's wrist. So he got it on one of his wrists. And Tracy was like, oh, excuse me. What do you think what's going on here? And didn't allow Dahmer to finish putting the cuffs on his wrist. He also, so this was happening in the bedroom, and he noticed there was a lot of sketchy photos of men on the side table next to the bed. And it looked really sketchy. So he just kind of notated that in his brain. And at one point, Dahmer was listening to Tracy's heartbeat and said something that really freaked him out. He said that he intended to eat his heart. He's like, oh, listen to that heart. I intend to eat that. And that freaked him out. So this is something that I haven't mentioned yet. At this point, Dahmer had started eating parts of his victims, so they would be forever a part of him. So that is where this heart comment is coming from. He genuinely was planning on eating it. So Tracy quickly thought to ask that if they could go back into the living room where the air conditioner was, and said, I actually need to use the bathroom. He was freaked out. At that point, Tracy just tried to book it for the front door. He actually had to punch Dahmer in the face, knocking him off balance to get out of the door. And at 11:30 p.m. on July 22nd, Tracy flagged down a police officer and explained what had happened, even showed him the handcuff on his wrist and said, hey, you need to come back with me to this dude's apartment. Some sketchy's going on here. So he led them back to Dahmer's apartment, where he found where Dahmer didn't really want to let them in. He was very hesitant to let them in, but eventually did. And what they found in that apartment would horrify them. So when Dahmer admitted to handcuffing Tracy, he stated that the key was back in his bedroom and he would go and grab it. Well, one of the officers, Officer Mueller, said, oh, no, I will go get the key. And Dahmer kind of freaked out and was like, no, you can't go in there. You can't go in there. That's when the other officer on the scene, Officer Routh, told Dahmer to back off and let the officer into the room. Upon entering the room, the officer, Officer Mueller, saw a knife tucked under the bed, which Tracy had told them that Dahmer had threatened him with a knife, and there it was under the bed. But he also saw a drawer open in the nightstand and noticed some Polaroids and saw that it looked like there was some weird stuff on the Polaroids. So he decided to take a closer look. So he pulled all the pictures out of the drawer. Well, this was all the pictures of Dahmer's victims in various stages of dismemberment. So the officer noted that the pictures had all been taken in that apartment that he was currently standing. And when Dahmer saw what Officer Mueller was holding, he freaked out and tried to resist arrest, forcing the officers to actually call backup. Once they had subdued him, so Officer Routh was sitting on his back, Officer Mueller began to look deeper into the apartment to see what else he could find, and actually opened the fridge, where he found the fresh head of a black man on the bottom shelf. Can you imagine? It makes me ill thinking about it. Ugh. So while pinned on the ground under Officer Routh, Dahmer turned his head to look at Officer Mueller in the kitchen and said, for what I did, I should be dead. So he knew what he did was wrong. Now, upon further investigation, the police found four severed heads in the kitchen, 7 skulls, 2 human hearts, and a portion of arm muscle, and that was just what was in the refrigerator. In the freezer, the horrors continued. There was a full torso, human organs, and there was flesh stuck to the ice of the bottom of the freezer. Oh, I just get the heebie-jeebies, just ugh, so disgusting. Now, in the rest of the apartment, they found 2 full skeletons, hands, and other things that we're not going to talk about. And you know they're bad. If I've already told you these other things that they found, and I'm not telling you this other stuff, you know it's got to be disturbing. So the chief medical examiner even said it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. That's how bad it was. Over the next few weeks, starting July 23rd, 1991, Dahmer began to confess everything because he said, quote, "I created this horror and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." How benevolent of him. Oh, wow. Look at that. My goodness. He talked about all the ways he had killed his victims and even admitted to eating them. And when asked why, he said, "I suppose in an odd way, it makes me feel they are even more a permanent part of me." Ew. Blech. So gross. So he claimed his increased killings recently were because of his compulsion to kill. And it was just getting worse and it was never ending. And he was willing to do whatever it cost to fulfill that urge. So he had built a kind of altar, by the way, with these skulls that he had saved. And in November of 1991, in an interview, he said that the altar was dedicated to himself and a place for him to meditate. Yeah, he made an altar out of skulls dedicated to himself so he could meditate. What a crazy person. Blah. On July 25th, 1991, he was officially charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and by August 22nd, he would be charged with 11 more murders, and in September, they would finally find his first victims behind his grandmother's house. Now, his trial began on January 30th, 1992. His defense tried to claim that Dahmer was suffering from a mental disease, but this defense did not work at all. He was ruled sane and guilty on February 15th after weeks of court testimony. In Dahmer's closing statement, he said, quote, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I've done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." Now, I did watch an interview with Dahmer while he was in prison, which, oh my gosh, you want to be creeped out? Go ahead and watch interviews of serial killers. It's freaky. But he said in this interview, like, they asked him, like, if you weren't locked up, would you still be killing people? And he was like, absolutely. That compulsion's still there. I still want to do it. And so I would definitely be doing it. So it's good that I'm in here. So I can't do it. I'm not allowed to do it anymore. So he knew that it was an issue and he would still be doing it if he wouldn't have been caught. So he was grateful that he'd been caught so he couldn't do it anymore. Now, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 10 years upon the first 2 counts. The death penalty actually wasn't an option for the judge, Judge Graham, who did the sentencing, since Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty since 1853. That's pretty impressive, I will say. Now, I feel like they could have made an exception in this case, but, you know, to each his own. Whatever. His first year in prison was spent in solitary confinement because they were actually really concerned for his safety. Womp womp. I mean, yes, he's still a human, but like, he was kind of a monster as well. But he soon began to read the Bible and actually eventually converted to Christianity. In May of 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister in the Church of Christ. Dahmer often asked Ratcliffe, because they became friends and he would visit often, if Dahmer asked if his continued life was seen as a sin by God because of the horrible things that he had done. Now, in July of 1994, another inmate actually tried to slash Dahmer's throat, but only gave him superficial wounds, and his family was very concerned. But Dahmer's reaction was basically, he told his mom, "It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me." He was just kind of like, I kind of deserve to die for what I did. On November 28th, 1994, Dahmer would actually be beaten to death by a fellow inmate by, ironically, a dumbbell. It's ironic that he was killed in the same exact way as he killed his first victim. It is just crazy that that is how it worked. And when his mother learned of his death, she said to the media, quote, "Now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everybody?" Now, his parents were able to get his ashes, and they divided his ashes between the two of them. So Jeffrey Dahmer killed a total of 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Most died of strangulation, but 4 of them died due to the holes drilled in their skull and either acid or boiling water being injected to their brains. And one of them was killed with a knife and bled out. What blows my mind still is that the police had him on their radar. They knew of him. He was convicted of multiple crimes. He was even on freaking probation, and they came to his house while there was a body in there, and they didn't catch him sooner. That's the thing that just irritates me so much about this case, is how bad and poorly the police did in this case. It blows my mind. Anyways, he will forever be known as an infamous serial killer who committed the most atrocious acts on his victims. And for that reason, Jeffrey Dahmer is our horrible human in history for the week. Now, if you liked what you heard, if you guys enjoy these stories, or if there's other people that you would like to suggest, be sure you're sending me messages. You can message me on Instagram or even comment on this podcast, and I will definitely take a look. I love getting suggestions, but make sure you're subscribing, following, and even sharing this with all your family and friends that you know would enjoy this kind of stuff. And then join me next week as we talk about a ruthless dictator who killed thousands of people that you probably haven't ever heard about or even know exists. His name is Jorge Rafael Villadella from Argentina. So listen in next week as we talk about all of the horrible things that he did to his people. We'll see you guys next week.